Welcome everybody here to Great Decisions 2021. Today's presentation by Professor Gregory Gause from the Bush School at Texas A&M University, and his talk will be on Persian Gulf security, a topic which has long been of great interest to people around the world, and especially the United States, at least front and center in our foreign policy for at least the last 30 years, if not longer. First, I wish to announce that this lecture series is a collaboration of the League of Women Voters of Tyler Smith County, the AAUW, the American Association of University Women of Tyler, the Tyler Public Library, and the Foreign Policy Association. My name is Jeffrey Crean. I am a professor of history at Tyler Junior College, and I'm honored today to announce our guest and introduce our guest, Professor Gregory Gause. Dr. F. Gregory Gause III joined the Bush School in 2014 as the head of the Department of International Affairs and holds the John H. Lindsey Class of 44 chair. He was previously a professor of political science at the University of Vermont, where he was chair of its Department of Political Science. Prior to his tenure at the University of Vermont, Dr. Gause served on the faculty at Columbia University from 1987 to 1995 and was fellow for Arab and Islamic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York from 1993 to 1994. His research focuses on international politics of the Middle East with a particular interest in the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. He has published 3 books, the most recent of which is 2010's The International Relations of the Persian Gulf, published by one of the leading academic presses in the world, Cambridge University Press. And his articles have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Security Studies, Middle East Journal, and The National Interest, among many others. And he has testified on Persian Gulf issues before the Council on International Relations of the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So that means, he is a very big deal. He is a very distinguished scholar, and you and I'm honored to have him present for us. And it is a real treat for you to listen to him, one of our leading experts on this important topic. So with that, I will give the floor to Professor Gause, and you may begin.
Thanks, Jeff. Howdy, everybody. Any Aggies out there? Well, I guess everybody's muted, so maybe I won't get a howdy back, but that's understandable. It's a pleasure to join you virtually, but it's also, of course, a disappointment to join you virtually. I would love to be out at Tyler visiting with you, but hopefully, when the plague passes, we'll be able to do these kinds of meetings face to face again. But until then, we will communicate via Zoom, something that I'm sure all of us are just about done with. Okay, the Persian Gulf. So the Persian Gulf's important. Why? Well, I think there's one word that describes the importance, and that's oil. Right? For decades, the United States has said that the free flow of oil from the Gulf region is a U.S. national interest. And while there's a debate about just how important oil should be going forward in American foreign policy, given our own improved energy situation with our dramatic increase in oil production here in the United States, and also with the more general debate that we're having about fossil fuels and what role fossil fuels should play in our energy mix, I think it's important to point out that American interest in the Persian Gulf region has never been about the oil that we import from the countries of the Persian Gulf. Our military and strategic and political interest in the Persian Gulf dates back to a period when the United States was the leading oil producer in the world and an oil exporter, not an oil importer. Even during the time periods where the U.S. was most dependent on the import of oil, the 70s, 80s, 90s, we got a very small percentage of our oil from the Persian Gulf. The reason that the United States was always interested in the Persian Gulf was not that we needed the oil, it's that the world needed the oil. And so access to oil in the Persian Gulf and the free flow of oil in the Persian Gulf was absolutely essential for the economies of our allies in Western Europe and in East Asia, right? None of which, with the exception of Great Britain, produces much oil. Persian Gulf oil remains central, particularly to the energy profile of the East Asian countries, especially China now. And so, and also, as I think everybody in Texas knows, the world oil market is a single market. And we here in Texas and in the United States are not immune to the price consequences of oil contingencies in the Persian Gulf. So if, for example, Saudi Arabian oil were to be cut off for some reason, right, it's not as if our energy prices here in the United States won't be affected, right? Oil really is a global market. And the price consequences of supply disruptions or demand changes ripple through the markets almost immediately. Again, I'm probably saying stuff that everybody, all Texans, probably know about. But you'll recall that when oil demand dropped precipitously at the beginning of the COVID crisis back in March, you couldn't give oil away for a while here in the United States. And in one dramatic period at the end of March, when futures contracts were coming due, you had to pay people to take physical delivery of oil off your hands, right? A quite dramatic turn of events, which was very specific to the particular market realities of the futures contracts and deliveries at Cushing in Oklahoma and all, but representative of the fact that the collapse of world demand for oil immediately impacted prices right here in the United States. And so the importance of the Persian Gulf, I think, transcends immediate debates about whether the US is quote unquote energy independent, and even the long-term debate about climate change. And that's why the Persian Gulf has always been important for every American administration. So what I'd like to do today is focus on what the Biden administration is facing in the Gulf and to some extent in the greater Middle East. Let me share a screen with you just so you don't have to look at me the whole time. And we can look at maps, which I always put up maps when I'm teaching to give the students something to look at besides me. So here's the core of the Middle East, doesn't include the North African countries. But let's think for 1 second about what the geopolitical situation is in this core area of the Middle East right now. I think it's defined by the fact that we have a number of cases of Arab countries that are undergoing civil wars, or where the state has become so weak that international intervention has become part of the reality of the political fight there. Of course, I'm talking about Syria and Yemen, most obviously. One could add Libya right over here. But I'm also talking about places where the state is relatively weak, where external actors can easily intervene in the politics of those countries: Iraq, Lebanon, the Palestinian Authority. And who's playing, and this is really the core of the geopolitical game in the Middle East right now, is how the politics of these countries, where politics are in flux, domestic politics are in flux, how are they going to play out? And that's where the game is right now. Iran has been very successful in supporting its allies and clients and proxies throughout the region. Now, most of these clients and proxies and allies of Iran share with Iran the Shia sect of Islam. Iran, the largest, most powerful Shia majority country in the Middle East and in the world, for that matter. It has, of course, extremely close relations with Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? The Shia militia and political group that really is the most powerful actor in Lebanese politics. Its support for the Assad regime in the Syrian civil war has been decisive in the Assad regime's ability to maintain itself in power in the face of this brutal civil war. It has a relationship with the Houthi movement down here in Yemen, which took over the capital of Sana'a and holds on to a large chunk of territory in Yemen, and the Saudis have been fighting that civil war in Yemen against the Houthis. The Houthis look to Iran for support. And the Iranians support a number of militias in Iraq. And I would say of all the foreign actors in Iraqi politics, Iran probably has the most influence, more even, I think, than the United States. So the Iranians have been doing very well in this geopolitical competition. The Saudis, not so well. They've been unsuccessful in turning back the Houthis in Yemen, unsuccessful at unseating Assad in Syria. They've tried to play into Lebanese politics, but basically have failed to dislodge Hezbollah as the major actor in Lebanese politics. And so in many ways, the Saudis are losing. But I don't think that we should see the geopolitics of the region as purely a Saudi versus Iran situation or purely a Sunni versus Shia situation. As important as those sectarian identities are, they, I don't think, define the geopolitics of this struggle right now. For one reason, there's one other really important player in the politics of these situations, and that's Turkey. Turkey, another very powerful Sunni regional state, represents a political stance very different from Saudi Arabia, right? The Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, really kind of speaks for and wants to speak for a bottom-up populist Sunni Islamic trend that is represented in the Arab world for the most part by the Muslim Brotherhood. So Erdogan has been supporting groups in the Syrian civil war, supporting groups in the Libyan civil war, has been involved in Iraqi politics, and even there's some indication might be trying to get involved down in Yemen. The Saudis really represent kind of a status quo, top-down version of Sunni Islam. They're very supportive of the dictatorship in Egypt, which of course overthrew a Muslim Brotherhood government back in 2013, a government that Erdogan was very supportive of. And so the Saudis and the Turks, even though they're both Sunnis, are frequently on different sides of the political conflicts of the region. So it's an extremely fluid and complicated geopolitics that the Biden administration is dealing with as it comes to office. So I think that the most important issue for the Biden administration, and certainly the one that they have teed up, the one that they think is going to be their first initiative in the region, is Iran. So back to watching me. We'll go back to the map during questions. You'll recall that the Obama administration entered into a nuclear agreement with Iran called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. This was an agreement not just between Iran and the United States, but between Iran, the United States, the other permanent members of the UN Security Council, Russia, China, Britain, and France, and also Germany. And that agreement called upon Iran to draw back in its nuclear program from being able to weaponize, to create a nuclear weapon. There are estimates that the Iranians were months away. The Iranians had to divest themselves of enriched uranium and take some other measures and move back from that, if you will, that weaponization point. And in exchange, a number of international sanctions that have been voted by the UN Security Council, were lifted on Iran. This was a deal made by the president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, largely because he wanted to get Iran back into the world economic system, wanted to improve the Iranian economy. Now, it's important to note that the Iran nuclear deal was solely about the nuclear issue. There were a lot of other issues people had with Iran, the Iranian activity in all these countries in the Middle East that I mentioned, Iranian missile capacity. But in order to get that agreement to walk the Iranians back from that weaponization point, the Obama administration was willing to put those issues on the side. Now, the Trump administration comes to power, the President Trump, very critical of the Iran deal for all sorts of reasons, and eventually withdraws the United States from the deal. Now, of course, you can't get UN sanctions back on Iran, right? The Russians, the Chinese, the Brits, the French, they all said, hey, we had this deal and we think it's working. The Iranians have walked back from that weaponization point. But the Trump administration was able to leverage American unilateral sanctions, particularly through the financial system, to impose real economic harm on the Iranians. Right? We were able to do that largely because the United States has a veto, really controls the world financial system. And if you as a third party wanted to buy Iranian oil, you would have to use a financial system in which the United States has some sway and control to pay the Iranians. And the US sanctions were very clear. If you did business with Iran as a third party, we would put sanctions on you and not allow you to do business in the United States. So the Trump administration was really able to squeeze the Iranian economy. This was a policy that the Trump administration called maximum pressure. And what it hoped was either this maximum economic pressure on the Iranians would bring them back to the table for a renegotiation in what the Trump administration hoped would be a better deal, quote unquote, or there's some evidence that senior members of the Trump administration were really looking for regime change in Iran. They were hoping that the squeezing of the Iranians would lead to the fall of the regime, and some new relationship could develop with what came after. So neither of those things happened. The regime is still there, and has broken out of the nuclear restrictions of the JCPOA, has started to increase the amount of enriched uranium it has, and has moved somewhat closer, although not as far as it was back in 2014, 2015, to that weaponization point. So in essence, the Trump administration policy of maximum pressure didn't achieve its goals. The Biden folks, including the president, in the campaign basically said, we want to come back into the Iran nuclear deal. We want to get the Iranians back to those limitations that the deal imposed on them. So here's the problem. First off, the Iranian president who signed that deal, Hassan Rouhani, has about 6 more months in office. There are going to be presidential elections in Iran in the summer, and Rouhani is term limited. He will not be in those elections. And so even if Rouhani wants to come back in, does he have enough time? Second problem, Rouhani and the people around him who argued within the Iranian political system for that first signing of the deal way back in 2015 have seen their credibility damaged by the American withdrawal. People in Iran who were suspicious of the deal, and that includes the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, who in the end has a veto over whatever happens here. And the if you will, the more aggressive and revolutionary forces represented by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, right? The military formation that guards the regime and whose Quds force supports the spread of the revolution's influence throughout the region. You might recall that in January of 2020, just about a year ago, the Trump administration killed the head of the Quds force, Qasem Soleimani, Iranian general, who was visiting with Iran's allies in Iraq. They killed him with a drone missile as he was leaving the Baghdad airport. Those factions in Iran don't want a renewal of the Iran nuclear deal. So the Biden administration is going to push on the nuclear deal first, but I don't know if they're going to be able to get into it, to get the Iranians back into it because of these domestic political issues in Iran. That's one issue, and the first issue of the Biden administration, and the most important issue, I think, in the minds of the Biden administration that they're going to face. The second issue that the Biden administration is going to face is how to deal with Saudi Arabia. So President Trump was very close with the Saudis. In many ways, he made the quote unquote special relationship with Saudi Arabia even more special. The Saudi leadership had direct links into the White House. The president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, very famously had a direct personal relationship with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. Should recall that the Crown Prince, a young man in his early to mid-30s, is really the day-to-day executive in Saudi Arabia. His father, King Salman, is somewhat removed from the day-to-day governing the country, still has a veto over what goes on, but he leaves his young son, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, in day-to-day control of the government. In fact, the Trump administration did something that no other American administration had done. It basically intervened in Saudi domestic politics to indicate that it wanted Mohammed bin Salman to rise to the level of Crown Prince. It was just a couple of months after President Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia was the first foreign country that President Trump visited. Normally, an American president's first visit is either to Canada or Mexico for obvious reasons. President Trump was to Saudi Arabia. And just a couple of months after President Trump's visit, Mohammed bin Salman, in effect, did a power play within Saudi politics. He turfed out the existing Crown Prince, Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, who was a first cousin of Mohammed bin Salman, and got his father to appoint him, Mohammed bin Salman, as Crown Prince. This was very interesting because the Trump administration made it clear that they liked Mohammed bin Salman and that they were happy to see this happen. I would say that that kind of open American involvement in the politics of the ruling family of Saudi Arabia really was unprecedented. And it linked the Trump administration to Mohammed bin Salman in a way that became very uncomfortable for the Trump administration. Because Mohammed bin Salman is a very aggressive guy and not very experienced on the international stage. You'll probably recall the thing that most Americans think about with Mohammed bin Salman is the killing of the Saudi dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed in 2018 in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, which was a great embarrassment to Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey. I said Saudi Arabia and Turkey, not always on the same team, even though they're both Sunnis. The killing of Jamal Khashoggi really created a public relations disaster for the Saudis in the United States. Khashoggi was well known in Washington. He was living in DC. He was known to American elites. And his killing, in a particularly brutal way, got the attention of the American media, particularly the Washington Post, where he was writing columns. And the Post is not letting that issue go. And so I would say that the killing of Khashoggi made the Trump administration's relationship with Saudi Arabia, and particularly with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a real political crisis. Well, crisis is the wrong word. A real political issue that they had to deal with. And a lot of opposition on Capitol Hill revolved around, and this was Democrats and Republicans, condemning the killing of Khashoggi and condemning MBS. The other issue that rose in the Trump administration to an issue of great concern in DC was the Saudi military intervention in Yemen, which I mentioned before. The Saudis had intervened in Yemen in 2015 militarily to try to prevent the Houthis from taking over the whole of the country. They did that, but they were not able to dislodge the Houthis from their strongholds or from the capital in Sana'a. And the Saudi campaign, which is mostly from the air, has been extremely damaging, lots of civilian casualties, and Yemen really is a great humanitarian crisis. Many people on Capitol Hill, particularly in the Democratic Party, took up the Yemen issue, pressed the Trump administration to stop supporting Saudi Arabia's campaign in Yemen. The Trump administration refused to do that. So the Biden administration has to confront the issue of what are we going to do with Saudi Arabia at a time when the Democratic Party has very much become or developed a consensus that if not Saudi Arabia, at least MBS is a dangerous character. Saudi Arabia has become a partisan issue in American politics in a way it never has been before. In the same way that in the last, well, let's say the last 10 years, so much in America has become a partisan issue. That's very dangerous for the Saudis because, you know, you can be great friends with the Republicans, but eventually the Democrats are going to get back in the power. The Biden administration has to decide how it wants to deal with Saudi Arabia. My read of Biden is that he doesn't want any more crises in the Middle East. He doesn't want any more crises in the Middle East. And so he's going to be very careful not to create a crisis with Saudi Arabia, not to intervene in its politics the way the Trump administration did, not to, in essence, say to the king, you've got to get rid of your crown prince or we can't deal with you. It really is, it would be a very difficult situation at a time when the Biden administration wants a new approach to Iran to have chaos, potentially chaos and crisis in Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, the Biden administration wants to make clear to Mohammed bin Salman that there are guardrails on what he can do. He's not a superpower. And if he wants to maintain a good relationship with the United States, he can't be like the Russians and the Chinese and even the Iranians who go off and kill their dissidents in third countries. And so trying to recalibrate the relationship with Saudi Arabia is going to be something that the Biden administration is also going to have to concentrate on. I don't think that is as central an issue as the Iran nuclear deal will be for the Biden administration. I think that's where their priority is going to be. Let me say one more thing about what's going on in the Gulf, and then we'll open it up for questions. And that's the Abraham Accords. You might recall that at the end of the Trump administration, the president was able to leverage American influence in the Gulf to get 4 Arab countries to officially recognize Israel, 2 of them in the Persian Gulf, Bahrain and the UAE. I'll share my map so you don't have to look at me. Bahrain, this small island country in the Gulf, and of course the United Arab Emirates here. The other 2 countries that officially recognized Israel in the last months of the Trump administration were Sudan and Morocco, way out here in North Africa. In terms of the Gulf countries, I think that and we should be clear, a lot of times in the media you hear these agreements referred to as peace agreements. They're not peace agreements. Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates and Sudan and Morocco were never at war with Israel. But they are, I think, significant in terms of formal diplomatic recognition by 4 more Arab states of the state of Israel. I think from an American interest point of view, that's a good thing. But we shouldn't exaggerate the importance of this. It doesn't change the geopolitics at all, right? It doesn't change the geopolitics at all. In fact, states like Bahrain and the UAE and Saudi Arabia that see Iran as a threat are already dealing with Israel behind the scenes, under the table. Right? I think that the formal recognition is more, I think it will have a long-term, more cultural impact. It doesn't have an immediate political impact on the geopolitics. But the reason I raise it is it underlines how important the United States is for the security of these countries on the Arab side of the Gulf. Because the only reason that Bahrain and the UAE agreed to these accords at the time that they did is because the President of the United States came to them and said, I want you to do this. And so while there are questions among people on the Arab side of the Gulf about the American commitment to the Gulf, questions about American credibility, I don't think that there's any way the Abraham Accords could have happened if the Emiratis and the Bahrainis thought that American power in the region was going down. So the Biden administration has challenges that it's going to face in terms of Persian Gulf policy, but it also has quite a bit of leverage. It has some power that it can exercise in the Persian Gulf. So with that, let me see if I can come back. People can see my face. I don't see the stop screen. Technology. It's so great. All right, I'm going to try to get out of here. There we go. And let's get back into Zoom. Can you folks see me? Jeff, come back on and tell me if you can see me.
Hi. Yes, so we could see you, but you're in a small screen. You need to. Most of the screen I'm seeing is black. I see a little corner of us.
Maybe we can ask Marilyn to come in and stop the screen share. Is that possible?
I think exit full.
I think Tammy might be the one to stop.
I can't stop the screen share. It actually has to come from the person that shared it. Sorry.
Oh, well, isn't that a problem? Sorry about that, everybody.
I think maybe under view options, there may be exit full screen or something.
Yeah, I'm not getting the, oh, I'm terribly sorry.
But we can still see you in the corner, so you can still ask.
Drag the black screen to the left is from Luann.
Is that any better?
Yes, that worked for me. Anyway, I did it on mine.
Should I just get out and come back in, perhaps?
No, you're fine. We can see you.
All right, I'm terribly sorry. I'll be so happy when this damn thing is over and we don't have to deal with this crap anymore.
Okay,
yeah.
Well, nonetheless, thank you for that entertaining, enlightening.
Oh, here, maybe I can do it this way. Stop share.
Yes,
Yay!
perfect.
Hooray!
Thank you for that illuminating tour de horizon of the entire region, covering a variety of issues, which I hope we can get into greater depth on in our question and answer period over the next 27 minutes. So for those of you, first of all, I just want to remind everyone this is being recorded and will be posted to a YouTube shortly thereafter. And if you wish, if you have questions for Professor Gause, please enter them into the chat box and I will present them to him. Until that happens, I'll begin with some questions of my own. I'll begin by asking you to go, you talked a bit of some touched on Yemen. So I'd like you to go in a bit more there about the Saudis' role in Yemen and both long-term and in the last 5-6 years with the war, and the US position on it in first the Obama, the Trump, and now the Biden administrations, because that has been a major sticking point among many between us and the Saudis.
Sure. Well, you recall from the map, and I'm not going to call up the map because I don't want to mess up anymore. But you recall from the map that Saudi Arabia has an enormously long land border with Yemen. And for decades, the Saudis have wanted Yemen to be part of their sphere of influence. They have intervened in Yemeni politics with their money, with their political relations, with tribal leaders and political leaders in an effort to be the dominant power in Yemen and not to allow anyone that they think is hostile to them to establish a foothold in Yemen. They really are neuralgic about people that they see as rivals getting influence in Yemen, because Yemen really is their backdoor. And so the Saudi interest in Yemen goes back decades. In fact, if you're really interested, my first book was on Saudi-Yemeni relations. And so It's old now. It was published in 1990, so it doesn't take us up to right now. But if you're interested in some of the history of U.S.-Saudi relations, you and my grandmother might be the only two people who have read that book. The Saudis intervened militarily with the Emiratis in 2015 when this group, the Houthis, captured Sana'a, the capital, and were marching toward Aden, the major port on the Arabian Sea in the southern part of Yemen. Now, the Houthis are a very interesting bunch. They come from a branch of Shiism that's called Zaydi or Sixer, Fiver Shiism, because they broke off at the fifth Imam. This is not the version of Shiism that is practiced in Iran, right? But the leadership of the Houthi movement, which comes from the al-Houthi family, which is why they're called the Houthis, they call themselves Ansar Allah, the partisans of God. But the leadership of the Houthi movement, right? A number of them went to Iran and studied, and they came back to Yemen with kind of an Iranian view of the geopolitics of the region. And so you'll hear at Houthi rallies, they'll chant death to America, death to Israel. Well, Israel and America aren't particularly relevant in Yemen, right? At least not directly. So my soundbite on this is the Houthis always wanted to be Iranian clients more than Iran wanted to be their patrons. But the Iranians found that supporting the Houthis was a really kind of cost-effective way to stick the Saudis right in the eye. Right? The Saudis spend billions in their air campaign and their military campaign in Yemen, whereas Iranian support for the Houthis probably is in the tens of millions of dollars, arms shipments, money, things like that. So the Saudis and the Emiratis have a military intervention in 2015. They're able to push the Houthis back away from Aden, but they're not able to dislodge them in Sana'a and the area in the northern part of Yemen. The Obama administration didn't particularly like this intervention, but because they were in the midst of trying to sell the Iran nuclear deal, which they accomplished in 2015, they basically said to the Saudis, look, you keep quiet about the nuclear deal. We won't give you that hard a time about Yemen. When the Trump administration came in, they were much more vociferous in support of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, but it became a partisan issue as Democrats in the Senate focused on Yemen and said, we, the United States, shouldn't be assisting the Saudis in this humanitarian disaster. And you got some very close votes on American military assistance to Saudi Arabia, votes that almost went against the administration, almost went against the Saudis over the Yemen issue. Now, the Biden administration has come back in and has a much more, as in everything, a much more Obama-like view of the Yemen situation. I think that we could see a diplomatic initiative from Secretary Blinken on Yemen. And I do think that there's a desire in Saudi Arabia to cut their losses in Yemen. The problem is that I don't think that they want to leave the Houthis in power in the capital in Sana'a. On the other hand, I'm not really sure how you get them out of there. The other problem for the Saudis, and maybe an opportunity for the Biden administration, is the only other power that really has much influence in Yemen, and that's certainly the only one that could have any influence on the Houthis, is Iran. So unless you're willing to bring Iran in on the deal, could be very difficult to get a diplomatic solution in Yemen.
Very good. We have a question from Jackie for you. You focused on the geopolitical aspects of the region, but does that mean that the U.S. move to green energy, et cetera, have little or no effect in the region?
So I think that the global moves toward away from fossil fuels are going to have a real long-term effect on the region, without a doubt. In the short term, not so much. Right? In the short term, our transportation economy all over the world still runs on fossil fuels, and the Persian Gulf is still the place where the most exports of oil reach world markets. Right? I do think in the long term, it has an enormous impact. I mean, all of these countries in the Persian Gulf region rely to some extent or another on oil exports for their economies. And to the extent that oil is less and less important, their economies are going to have to change. Will they be able to do it? It would be a wrenching and difficult change, right? Many of these countries are among the richest in the world, the small countries like Qatar and Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates, among the richest countries in the world per capita, based on their oil and, in Qatar's case, natural gas exports. That's one of the reasons Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia put out this very ambitious economic transformation plan called Vision 2030, where he wanted to move the Saudi economy away from its over-reliance on oil. And we can see the economic effects of the collapse of oil prices in all of these countries, right? The combination of COVID and global oversupply of oil, right, drove prices down. We know in 2020, drove prices down dramatically. They're now back up to around $50 a barrel, right? But they were down in the 30s. And for that very brief period, you know, you had to pay me to take your oil. Right? And so there's a quote from a former Saudi oil minister who said, "The Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones." And what he meant was the oil age is not going to end because we run out of oil. And the last oil that's produced in the world for commercial purposes is going to be produced in the Persian Gulf and probably in Saudi Arabia, because they still have the lowest cost of production of any oil in the world. But as the world shifts to non-fossil fuel energy, this part of the world is going to become poorer and less important. There's no question about that. The only question is, how long does that take?
Very good. Now I have a question from Luann. Luann asked you regarding, first of all, she congratulates Brenda on her great question. And secondly, Luann asked you regarding the Iran nuclear agreement, you stated that other issues were not addressed in order to keep the Iranians interested in the agreement back in the Obama years. Could you speak to these other issues, such as human rights, et cetera, and how the US can influence those issues in Iran?
Right. So the human rights issue really wasn't on the table. Even on the edge of the table when the Iran nuclear issue was being negotiated. The two issues that were kind of on the table and that were of interest to America's regional friends and allies like Israel and the Gulf states were first Iranian involvement in the politics of these war-torn countries in the Arab world, Iraq, Syria, to some extent Lebanon and Yemen. If you sit in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, you look around and you see Iranian influence in Iraq, Iranian influence in Syria, Iranian influence in Yemen and Iran across the Gulf from you, and you say the Iranians are trying to encircle us. And the Israelis see Iranian influence in Lebanon, Iranian influence in Syria, and say the Iranians are trying to move closer to us. The Iranians made it clear that their geopolitical gains, and these geopolitical gains are really interesting. I'll say something about that in a minute, but the Iranians made it clear that their geopolitical gains in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon were not on the table. They were just not talking about it. We'll talk about the nuclear issues, but we're not going to talk about those geopolitical gains. We're not going to roll them back, and we're not going to talk about our missiles either. The missile issue and the Iranian involvement in the region, those were the two geopolitical issues that were really on the table. Human rights issues in Iran are probably not going to be on the table. The Iranian government just isn't going to discuss its domestic politics with outsiders. I think there was some hope in the Obama administration that if the nuclear issue got settled and a more cooperative relation with Iran started, that over time, moderates in Iran would become more powerful. They would be less aggressive in the region, and also they would improve the human rights situation. Now, that was a long-term bet that the Obama people made, right? Who knows whether it would have come out or not. The Trump administration said, that sounds like a bad bet to us. Pressure is the only way to get the Iranians to react. So I think that we're back to a Biden administration, right, that in many ways is the third term of Obama, that wants to try that engagement with Iran. But I doubt that those geopolitical issues would be on the table, much less domestic issues in Iran like human rights. I mentioned Iranian influence in the region. Let me just do a little parentheses on that. How did Iran get so influential in the region? They're influential in places where the government is very, very weak, can't resist this kind of external political intervention, or where the government has collapsed. The biggest geopolitical gain for Iran came from the American invasion of Iraq. We destroyed the state in Iraq, in the Saddam Hussein state. We destroyed it. As a matter of policy, we chose to destroy that state, not just the regime, not just him personally. We chose to destroy the state. We disbanded the army. We made the ruling party illegal. And we said, if you wanted to serve in the bureaucracy, if you had been a member of the old ruling party, you couldn't do it. Trouble is, in a system like Iraq, like Saddam's Iraq, like the old Soviet Union, anybody who moved up the government ladder had to become a member of the Ba'ath party, the ruling party. So we took the three pillars of the modern third world authoritarian state, the army, the ruling party, and the bureaucracy, and we destroyed them. In the belief, in the hubris, that we could rebuild an Iraqi state from the ground up. What we basically did was create in Iraq a playing field that the Iranians could intervene in. And they did it very successfully, supporting militias, supporting Shia politicians, establishing relations with all sorts of political parties and groups. The Iranians have been able to do the same thing in Lebanon, very weak state. And now that the government in Yemen has collapsed with the revolt of 2011 and then the Houthi movement, they're looking to do the same thing there. In Syria, it's a little different. They had an alliance with the government, right, with the Assad government in Syria. But in their support for the Assad government, the Iranians have been building a militia like Hezbollah that they hope will, much as in the case of Iraq, much as in the case of Lebanon, be a permanent source of influence for them in Syria once this civil war ends. So when you look at Syrian influence, you got to say the American invasion of Iraq was a real plus for Iranian influence in the region to spread.
Very good. A good question from Marilyn here. Marilyn asks, this is a little off topic, but what is going on in these countries in terms of COVID and how is it impacting them geopolitically?
Well, COVID is really bad throughout the region. Iran had a really bad case at the beginning. The Saudis have had a very difficult time with COVID. They had to cancel the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca as a public health measure last year in 2020. They're all suffering internally because of this, but I think geopolitically, the real issue that COVID has brought about is the collapse of oil prices, right? The fact that COVID has so limited world economic activity, world travel. It drove demand for oil down, and we saw the collapse of oil prices. And since every one of these countries, to a greater or lesser extent, relies on oil revenues to support their governments, this had a real impact on their domestic politics and on their influence in the world. Now, with China coming out of COVID and being a driver of the world economy, we're seeing demand for oil going back up. Obviously, when we get out of this, God willing, vaccines coming soon, and we can get back to something approaching normal life, I think our economy will shoot up too, and I think we'll see oil prices go up. But I think the big geopolitical hit from COVID for the countries of the Gulf has been the decline in oil prices.
Very good. I'd like to ask about some question on the military situation in the regions, because this is about the now the second, what it would have been the 30th anniversary of the second week of the Persian Gulf War, where the U.S. came to Saudi Arabia and evicted Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces from Kuwait. And a huge difference between the situation now and 30 years ago, among many other differences, is the Saudi military, which was not very big then, and I believe they are among the top 5 military spenders in the world now. They have a very large military. Whether they're able to do much with it is another matter. So I'd like to ask you first about the Saudi military, both in terms of its weight in the region in Yemen and other places, the U.S. involvement with the Saudi military, and possibly a bit on the U.S. involvement with the United Arab Emirates military, which, though smaller, has been foot soldiers for the Saudis in Yemen and also served their special forces, I know, served alongside American troops in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I teach at the Bush School, and our namesake is George H.W. Bush, the 41st president, who I will very happily say was the last really good foreign policy president that the United States had. And so I'm more than happy to talk about the 30th, as we're rolling up to the 30th anniversary of the Gulf War that liberated Kuwait and that restored the status quo, the political and territorial status quo in the Persian Gulf. That was one of the great successes of George H.W. Bush, right? Along with presiding over the peaceful end of the Cold War, a remarkable achievement, and a number of other things. So hooray for President Bush. So Saudi Arabia has always spent a lot of, since the 70s when it got rich on oil, always spent a lot of money on weapons, but has never built a big army because the leadership of Saudi Arabia back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s remembered the 50s and 60s when Arab monarchs were overthrown by Arab armies. So they spent a lot of money, but they didn't build a big ground force. And in fact, they divided their ground force into 2 separate forces, you know, the regular army and then the National Guard with a completely different command structure that was meant to act kind of as a check on the regular army. And so nobody really worries that much about the Saudi ground forces. They're not particularly effective or efficient. The Saudi Air Force, they've spent a lot of money on platforms. They're not a terrible Air Force, but as we can see from the Yemen campaign, they're also not a particularly skilled Air Force. They tend to drop their bombs way too high because they don't like to get down toward where anti-aircraft fire could be a threat to them, and thus they're not very accurate with their bombs. A lot of the problems with civilian deaths are a result of the Saudi Air Force not being able to hit its targets. So nobody really worries about the Saudi army that much, or the Saudi Air Force. In many, many respects, these enormous purchases of weapons from the United States, but also from France, from Great Britain, were meant to be the political glue tying these great powers to Saudi security. And it worked in 1990, right? It worked. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and menaced Saudi Arabia, the United States, France, Great Britain came to its aid. So the Saudi strategy has worked. Now the Emirates have a different strategy, right? Former Defense Secretary Mattis nicknamed them Little Sparta. If you've ever been to Dubai, it doesn't give you the atmosphere of Sparta, as I imagine it must have been back in ancient Greece. Much too hedonistic. But the UAE did build small but effective special forces units, including Emiratis, but also soldiers recruited from other parts of the world. And they fought with the United States in Afghanistan after 9/11. And the UAE did land troops in Yemen and fought on the ground against the Houthis to push the Houthis away from Aden. So the UAE actually does, I think, have a more effective ground force, but they're small, right? They can't take anybody, they can't take a major regional power on. But the interesting thing is, I don't think anybody fears the Iranian ground forces either. Iran is able to spread its influence not because people worry about the Iranian army marching across borders and taking them over. The Iranians have been able to spread their influence because they've been able to develop close relationships with clients and allies in these broken Arab states. They've been able to develop relationships with groups that want to be allied to Iran, that want to extend Iranian influence into their countries, that are ideologically committed to this. The Saudis have never been able to do that because the people who in many ways are closest to the Saudis, or maybe before MBS, who has reduced the importance of religious institutions in Saudi Arabia in the last couple of years. But the people who the Saudis might have been closest to ideologically in terms of their interpretation of Islam were Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And Al-Qaeda and ISIS hate the Saudis and want to kill them. So the Saudis have never had that reliable ally in these fights in Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen. They never had it. And the Iranians have, and that's the way the Iranians have been able to spread their influence.
Very good. Question from Jackie. What effect will our recent insurrection, I guess that in particular, and our kind of political polarization and tumult in general have on our influence in the region?
I think it will have as much influence as we here in the United States want it to have. It seems to me that the greatest threat to America's role in the world are our domestic divisions. If every foreign policy issue becomes fiercely partisan, if every foreign policy issue becomes an opportunity for the party out of power to slang the party in power, then I think our credibility does go down. One of the things about the United States during the Cold War and even in the immediate post-Cold War period is, I would never say that politics stopped at the water's edge, but there was something of a bipartisan consensus in how America should act in the world. You know, differences on tactics, certainly a serious debate about the Iraq War of 2003, right? But we went into the Iraq War of 2003 with a substantial number of Democratic votes in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. I don't know if we can reclaim that sense of common purpose in the world, but I keep my fingers crossed. Saudi Arabia is a perfect example of this. Saudi Arabia really doesn't have much of a domestic constituency in the United States. Not many people like Saudi Arabia. But American presidents, Republicans and Democrats, wanted to have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia because they saw its strategic usefulness. And both Democrats and Republicans in Congress were willing to follow administration lead in terms of arms sales and things like that to Saudi Arabia. If our relations with Saudi Arabia, if our initiatives to Iran become purely partisan, then I think people in the region are going to say America can't keep its promises, because if the next party comes in, they're just going to reverse policy. So I think that this is all in our hands. As citizens, we can tell our elected representatives in the executive and legislative branches, get your act together. I think that's the biggest threat to our influence in the world, and that's the problem we're going to have to overcome to continue to exercise our influence around the globe.
Very good. I would like to continue this for another half hour, but we're running out of time. And I'd like to conclude by your statement by mentioning, in relation to the Gulf War, a comment in a letter from George H.W. Bush in 1990 to President Francois Mitterrand of France. And he was talking about why he wasn't going to impose democracy on the Kuwaitis after we gave them back their country. And he said, democracy cannot be imposed, but must be nurtured from within. And he was speaking about the rest of the world at that time. But I think that quote can even apply to us in our own era. And I will leave us on that. And thank you, Professor Gause, for your enlightening talk and enlightening answers to all these questions. It was a great enjoyment for us, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. And join us next week for a different talk on a different region, a very different region, about as far away from the Persian Gulf as you can get, the fight over the melting Arctic. So with that, I will leave you and have a good rest of your day and rest of your week, and see you hopefully next Thursday.
Bye.
Thank you so much.